Okay, we have another problem that we want to look at here called balanced strings. So in this problem, you have to write a function to accept strings containing x's and o's. If there are more x's than o's, return x. If there are more o's than x's, then return o. And if they're an equal or not, return balanced. So for examples, so here are some examples. If you get the input of xx o o o o o x, then that should return o. You get an input of XOXO, and that should return balanced. And if you get an input of XXOXX, then that should obviously return an X. All right. So what are your inputs? Your input will always be a string. What are your outputs? Your output will always be a string. Now, this is a type of problem that really has so many solutions. But we're going to talk about ways that you could use a loop. Right? This is a place where we could create an accumulator pattern. Not the shortest way to do it, but if you're used to looping through things, this is a place where looping could be an appropriate tool. Well, why could looping be an appropriate tool? Because if you loop through this string, you could conceivably count the number of, of x's that you have. You could have an x count for the number of x's and then increment that, and then have a y count. An O count and increment that. You could push all the x's into an array and then compare the length of that array to the O array. Lots of different ways to solve it, right? So we'll say function, we'll just call this function balance strings. And there will be an input coming in. And then we want to console.log balance strings. And then XOXO. We'll do three different console logs for the different cases. That's the balanced. That's the O heavy string. And that's the X heavy string. And notice this X heavy string doesn't even have any O's in it. So we'll make sure that we're counting if there's nothing. So we could loop, right? For var I equals 0 and less than input that length. Equal plus. So one way we could do, like we said before, we could have arrays. So we could say var X array equals this, var O array equals this. If input at I equals O, O array, push, O, else, and where should we, it's part of the, we should, part of the parameters, we should say the array, the string will only contain X's and O's, no other characters. So if that's the case, then we could have an else statement here. If the input I equals O, then O array.push O, else X array push X. And we would say if O array at length is greater than, well, we'll do the edge case first, right? Remember we said that if they're equal, let's get that out of the way. So O array at length is equal to x array dot length, and we want to return balanced. And then we could say if array dot length is greater than x array dot length, then return O, else return X. So why do we use an accumulator here? We use an accumulator so we could just tally up, you know, push these O's into here and then push these X's in there. Which it doesn't even really matter what you push in there because we're just comparing the length of the arrays. So the first one is balanced. The second one is O heavy, and the second one, I'm sorry, first one is balanced. The second one is O heavy, and the third one is X heavy. But we can, instead of doing that, we could just do X count equals 0, and O count equals 0. Then put I equals O, then O count plus plus. Otherwise, X count. And then we say if X count, you get the idea. Else if O count is greater than X count, return O, else return X. So it's the same concept, same answers. And like we said before with the ternary, we could just do return O count is greater than X count, O, X. Of all of that. You saw the previous videos when we talked about ternary statements. You don't get any extra points for necessarily for doing ternary statements. Sometimes it's just for you if you really feel like you want your code to be shorter and a little cleaner. And there we go. So this is an example of an accumulator pattern as well. So you really have to decide what you want to do. Now you can solve this with regular expressions. There's lots of other ways to do it. But, this is one way of doing a problem like that.